أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مركدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لتمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد سورة المباركة الفاتحة بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم
بل محمد وآل محمد صلوات. وہ کارواں سرور کا جو شان سے نکلا تھا، صغرا کو خبر کیا تھی، نہ لوٹ کے آئے گا۔ مہمان بلایا ہے اے کوفیوں سرور کو، کیا کنبہ شہدی کا پانی نہ ہی پائے گا۔ پامال ہوا قاسم یوں گوروں کی ٹاپوں سے، کس طرح چچا تیری میت کو اٹھائے گا۔ تھا ہاتھوں کے کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو، سیدانیوں کا پردہ اب کون بچائے گا۔ ٹوٹی ہے کمر شہ کی، گھبرانا مگر اکبر، فرزند نبی تیری لاش کو اٹھائے گا۔ سوتے نہ تھے تم اصغر، جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے، دنیا کو خبر کیا تھی، ایک تیر سلائے گا۔ اصحاب ندم تورا شبیر کے زانوں پر کس زانوں پہ سر اپنا شبیر کٹائے گا سرور نے اٹھائی تھی سب ساتھیوں کے لاشیں شبیر تیرا لاشا اب کون اٹھائے گا کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا دل والوں کے آنکھوں سے ایک دریا بہائے گا محمد وآل محمد صلوات
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dr. Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani, respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let us begin by sending our condolences to the Imam for our time as we commemorate the Wafat of Imam Ali Un-Naqi alayhi salam. Surah Al-Fatiha is requested for the Isala Sawab of Marhumeen listed on the screen and for all Marhumeen. Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman. Hayy Yujib is requested for the names listed on the screen and for all those in need here and elsewhere. Let us recite together. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Amma yujibul mutarra idha da'a wa yakhshifu as-su' أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Youth Game Night. The youth have organized a game night and discussion with Dr. Sayyid Kirmani on Saturday, January 20th at 7 p.m. here at the Masjid, inshallah. This will be open to all youths ages 14 to 20. There will be pizza and dessert served. Please register on the link on the screen by January 18th. Senior Cruise. Masjid Hayy Seniors invites you to travel with them to the Caribbean and Mexico. Seniors from Orlando, Toronto, and New York will be meeting here in Orlando to enjoy a 7-night cruise aboard the beautiful MSC Seashore from April 21st to 28th. Book by January 15th to reserve at a group rate. For more information, please contact Sister Batul Mukhi at 785-220-0015. Administrative and Assistant Job Opening. Masjid Hayy is pleased to announce an exciting opportunity to join us as a paid part-time administrative assistant. As an integral part of our team, the administrative assistant will play a key role in ensuring the smooth and efficient functioning of our operations. Responsibilities will include providing secretarial and administrative support, managing communication channels, and assisting with various organized tasks. If you believe you have the skills and enthusiasm to excel in any of this, we encourage you to apply. Please submit your resume and cover letter highlighting your relevant experience to info@masjidalhayy.org by January 31st. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Kirmani to give tonight's speech with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا إلا المودة في القربى صدق الله العلي العظيم زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman here in Florida, across the globe, wherever you may be hearing my voice, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: how does one lead in turbulent times? When we come to the era in the history of the world, you'll find various trends, and you'll find that oftentimes in movements there are ups and downs, there are revolutions, there are historical rises and historical declines. And in that, oftentimes in the narrations and the stories and the history that's tallied, you'll often find that there's leadership involved in some way, for better or for worse. And in that, you may find that there are different styles and types of leadership. One being overt leadership, that is very clearly, distinctively at the front. But there may be other forms of leadership that happen in the way of being indirect leadership. And it's important to understand these things. When we come to the history of Islam, you'll find there are certain periods that are noteworthy. You'll find the early era of Islam, the era of Rasulullah himself and his companions. You'll then find after the demise of Rasulullah, you'll find the era of the Umayyads predominantly, but before the Umayyads you have the Khulafa, as the world calls them, the Khulafa al-Rashidin. Of course, we don't accept all of them as rightly guided, we only accept Amir al-Mu'mineen as bila fasal, but beyond that, they call this the period of the Khulafa. So these four are there, and then afterwards, and according to even some scholars of the general Muslim community, it also includes the 6 months or so of Imam Hassan's rule as well. And then comes the era of the Umayyads, and then you find this period in the history of Islam. And then after the Umayyads, you find the transition from the Umayyads going into the Abbasids, and then you find the Abbasids ruling, and then you find their rise and then also their decline. And then afterwards you find other empires that ruled and other people that ruled. You can go through the history, you can find, for example, the Fatimids, or you can find the Mamluks, and you can also find, for example, all the way up until what they call the gunpowder empires, which were, of course, the Ottomans and the Mughals and the Safavids. So this is a broad history of how Islam is categorized by those who study Islam formally, either in academia or other institutions. Coming to this, when we look at the life of the Imam who you and I are here to commemorate, our 10th old Imam, you'll find that he's living at a very important junction in Islamic history. Of course, these junctions all have their importance, but the important element is the life of this Imam can tell us much about how we are supposed to navigate turbulent times that we may be facing. Times that may be turbulent, difficult in terms of politics, economics, social, and otherwise. And it's very important to reflect on this Imam's life in particular, so that we can understand from his life how the Ahlul Bayt teach us to live in turbulent times, and how the Quran invites us, and ultimately Allah wills for us to navigate difficult times. To this end, I want to look at a few things with you tonight. Number one, what was this era in which the Imam was operating? And how did he proceed in operating as a leader in this time? And how is it that sometimes he was leading from the sidelines, as we would say, or he was leading from the back, or he was leading from behind the veil, as to speak, but he was still leading? And how does he give us a leadership example of our current Imam and how that could have happened? Number one. Number two, when it comes to this, what are some of the examples of the guidance of the Imam and how he helped even in these tumultuous times and these difficult times? And finally, what I want to look at with respect to this is, how does this relate to our world, our times, and what were the things that were going on during the time of the Imam so many years ago, over 1,000 years ago, that seems to have not changed very much in our era and our time. This is our agenda for the brief moments we are together. Wherever you are, here in Florida or across the globe, from the bottom of your heart, send a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala. At the first level, you'll notice some things that emerge, and it's important for us to understand and try to look at some questions here. You'll notice as Islam began to move from the era of the Khulafa into the era of for example, the Umayyads and then the Abbasids, you'll find that certain changes emerged. And many times people will say culture was there and culture was infused. I mean, think about it, and just seeing that the Muslim empire is expanding, it's moving from Mecca and Medina, Hijaz, or the western bank of modern day Saudi Arabia, throughout now what is the Arab belt, Northern Africa, and also into Persia, and beyond that. We had mentioned in the night when we were discussing Imam al-Baqir, where we were talking about, by that time, during the Umayyads time, and then coming into the Abbasids, Islam had already expanded from Hind to Sindh on the east side by Muhammad ibn Qasim, and then on the other side by up to Morocco, which is the era and time of Gibraltar or Jabal Tariq, and these types of things had happened already by this era and time. So now, when this is going on, there's an environment where culture is there. Now the question comes is, culture or religion? Are these two things at odds? Because many times, especially in our world today, people will say, get rid of all of the culture, let's go back to original Islam. And that comes in the aspect of what's the benefit of this? Let's get rid of all the cultures. And the reality of this is we need more nuance in this conversation. That is, things in our world are not always black and white. If you ask someone who studies something or someone who studies complex phenomenon, for example, someone who studies the financial markets, someone who studies medicine, someone who studies other things, just because you solve one problem doesn't mean that there's a silver bullet, black and white solution. That's why you'll find many physicians, they won't often give blanket statements that this applies to everybody. Because the particular individual may have differences in terms of genetics, in terms of their lifestyle habits, in terms of many other things that particular individual needs a different dosage. Even in the spiritual realm, the scholars say that. Now, when people say, let's go back to the original Islam, our own ulama who have studied this, they have different views on this. For example, Allama Tabatabai and other scholars who come afterwards have said, it's not necessary that the people who were there directly during the time of Rasulullah understood Islam better than us. Not necessary. And the reason is, the human mind has evolved over time, and over the centuries, people build on other people's knowledge, and we may now have a better understanding of some of the verses of the Quran than people 1,000 years ago did, number one. Number two, there's also an implicit assumption that you may be overlooking. This is what the scholars say. And that is, you're assuming that the early companions of Rasulullah, they themselves didn't have any cultural baggage. And the reality is, they did have cultural baggage. And Rasulullah at times corrected that cultural baggage. So to assume that there was no cultural baggage in the early days of Islam is also a fallacy. It's not correct necessarily. And the third element of the equation is, what about those good things that may have come from culture? Not everything that comes from culture is necessarily bad. And that's where it's very important for us to understand what dynamics of the equation may be very fruitful. You may find that when Islam went into the Persian belt, much spirituality emerged that the entire world is benefiting from today. For example, the non-Muslim world sometimes benefits more from some of the spiritual poets who came in the Irfani tradition of Islam. And you'll find even some of our great scholars wrote poetry for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a spiritual way. You'll find the examples of Allama Tabatabai, Sayyid Khomeini, and many other examples of people who were there. So just because culture is there, it's a more nuanced conversation needed. Now, coming to the era of the Abbasids, which is leading into the time and at the crux of the time of when they're starting to decline during the time of the 10th Imam, you'll notice that culture seemed to take precedence over religion. And that's something we do have to be careful about. Culture can bring in many good things. So for example, during the time, what was the good elements that were being expanded upon? Islam already encouraged. You see, Islam said it encouraged knowledge. And how you pursue knowledge will be depending on the time and the space. In the past, people used to pursue knowledge using certain tools. Today, we use computers, AI, other technology in order to pursue knowledge. Today, we have advanced systems that allow us to do that. In the past, they didn't have those things. But the principle Islam said is pursue knowledge, pursue ilm. Similarly, Islam says cover the body, for example. It doesn't say I necessarily have to wear exactly what the people of Rasulullah at that time were wearing. As long as my clothing meets that needs of what Allah has said, it could be a dishdasha, kandura, whatever. It could also be, for example, a shalwar kameez or something of that nature, or sharwani or something. As long as those criteria are being met. Number two, the next element of what I wanted to say is that there was a lot of progress going on during the time of the Abbasids, but culture seemed to take precedence in the sense that they began to undermine religion and faith at times. And that's where the problem arises. So it's important for us to understand this context of this environment that emerges. The next level is, when did the Imam come to the mantle of Imamat? Now, up to the 8th Imam, as you know, the dynamics of how the leadership of the later Imams, in particular the 8th Imam, the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, all the way up to the Imam of our time, how they led and how they operated was very different than some of the other Imams on the surface level. So Imam Hussein alayhi salam is going to the battlefield in Karbala, but his descendants are not necessarily going to the battlefield and fighting. In fact, Imam al-Kadhim is in prison at least 14 years. Imam al-Rida becomes the heir apparent, the crown prince of the rulers at the time, right? Of the Abbasids, of Harun and the likes. And then you come to an era of time where then you have the later Imams. After Imam al-Rida, they used to call the Ahlul Bayt and the descendants of the Ahlul Bayt, a particular name was Ibn al-Rida. That is the descendants of Rida, that is the 8th Imam. And so when they used to refer to him in this manner, they used to discuss them and they used to talk about them. Now, when it comes to these particular Imams, it's very important for us to be cautious, careful, and understanding about these dynamics of the equation. And these Imams became Imams at relatively young ages. I'm talking about 9 or 6 or the likes. Now, as far as our ulama and our scholars are concerned, they say that knowledge, Allah gives knowledge to whomever He wills. And there are numerous examples of this throughout history. The principle being, when the Imam comes to this, Islam didn't have a basis that knowledge or leadership is contingent or dependent upon age. It's possible that someone is very young and they just are more aware of what is needed. That's Allah's will in terms of what's needed. In fact, we're facing this problem in our world today. There's having discussions in politics and our arena. Should there be an upper limit to a senator or a congressman or someone of this nature? And right now we don't seem to have one, but at what point does someone say, I'm ready to retire? And when do I throw in the towel? When people are hitting upper 80s, 90s in this age and they're still operating? Are they still in control of their faculties? But what about on the other end of the spectrum? When it comes to this, you may find that it's possible that somebody who has the ability to lead, they may not be limited to the societal boundaries. And I'll invite you to look at examples throughout history and our modern times of people or young people who are maybe 13, 14, 15 and graduated from college sometimes. Sometimes they got doctoral degrees by the time they were 16. They were just advanced compared to everyone else. This is just today, in this era, in this time. I'm saying this because sometimes when you're used to something and you see something that's out of the norm, it's something that seems strange. Now coming to the Imam of the time of this Imam very quickly, political turmoil, it's not always necessary that someone who's leading has to always lead from the front. In fact, you may find that some of the best leaders are not always leading from the front, but rather they may be leading from the back, or they may be leading from the sides. And you'll find that that's still a form of leadership. We say this because, coming to the Imam of our time, in the system of wikala, the system of marja'iyya, the system of scholarship, it didn't start with our 12th Imam, the Imam of our time. It had begun before, especially during the time of our 10th Imam. And in that environment, the Imam shows us how to navigate. How does this apply? Imam is in a circumstance which I wanted to explain to you. What circumstance? He's under heavy house arrest. He's under heavy surveillance. He's under heavy problems and challenges that he's facing, and so he's not allowed to overtly preach. But still in that environment, the Imam gave, for example, Ziyarat-e-Jami'ah, which is a very beautiful ziyarah, which gives us quite a bit of insight in the maqam, in the position of the Imams in Ahlul Bayt. Implicit forms of explaining to the leadership and the followers in the Shi'as what is truth. Similarly, in our world, when we notice there's trepidation, there's fear, people are afraid. I was just reading a report of professors at the universities, the top universities, published by NPR had put this out, National Public Radio, that many professors in academia are self-censoring. Self-censoring means, on the issue of what's going on in the Middle East, they want to say something, but they're not saying it. Why? Because there's fear, trepidation about the repercussions of what could happen. Now, academia was theoretically supposed to be immune from this, but it's not, unfortunately. And the people who lose out are us as society when things like this happen. And so I'm saying is, in an environment where you may want to do something and you may want to change the world for the better, and you feel that there is fear, there are still ways that you can do things behind the scenes. It's not always necessary to be at the forefront and speak out loud. Believe me, between me and you, sometimes I've met people in our communities who are doing amazing things in terms of political, economic activism, but they're not always doing it in the public eye. They may be doing it behind the scenes. And that's also just as important. So just because we don't see something doesn't necessarily mean that it's not being done. In fact, you may find that some of the people who take the most criticism, sometimes, not always, some of the people who take the most criticism from the public are sometimes the ones who are doing the most behind the scenes. And sometimes, in life, people just need a villain to point and blame. And that's the reality of the world. Because sometimes we have this frustration inside that I want to do something, I'm not doing something, so I need someone to blame and put the blame on. And this happens all the time, and you can look at this pattern throughout life. So if you want to do something, learn from this Imam and know that there's other ways of doing things. And it doesn't always have to be overt. It could be covert. It could be through writing, through having meetings. It could be through even your economics. Nobody even needs to know about it necessarily. If you want to, that's fine. Because I know that in this environment, many people have said, they feel this trepidation, they feel the repercussion, they feel there's a pressure about what to do. And in that environment, you have the example of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, but we also have the example of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala. So it's important for us to realize this, number one. The next element with respect to this Imam is, what does he do during this time and this era? So he gives implicit guidance. He establishes a system of wikala, of representatives, of scholars, which, by the way, was not even brand new during that time even. He was following from what his grandfather had done and his great-grandfather had done. Example, Imam as-Sadiq was teaching in the University of Medina, which he helped to expand from his father. But if you know very clearly, there came a moment in time where even afterwards, Imam as-Sadiq had representatives or students of his in Kufa and other places who had a satellite campus. And they were saying, Qala as-Sadiq. And people would defer to them when it came to Kufa or Basra or other places. They would refer to them in terms of getting their answers. So there's a precedent there as well. Another element of the equation is the divine help that sometimes this Imam brought to the forefront. Why do we commemorate these Imams? Why do we remember these people? It's important for us to understand the Ahlul Bayt in light of the Quran. I'll give you an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, وَقَلِيلَ الْإِبَادِيَ الشَّكُورِ. And He says, a few of my servants are shakireen, or do shukr, and that is are grateful. Now, in this environment, you'll find when we look at the story of the Imams and the narrations of the Imams, despite difficult times, despite heavy persecution, despite having their loved ones killed, but despite all the difficulties, you would still find that in the most difficult of times, they were in a state of gratitude and gratefulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you see, when you look at Karbala and Imam Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt and Bibi Zainab and Imam Sajjad, even despite the difficulties, first doing sajda to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, thanking for this, because there's the element of sabirin and shakirin. I'm telling the next generation and our generation currently and the future to say, look, why are we having these commemorations? It's not only about the personality themselves, it's about understanding who are those people on earth who actually fully implemented the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Quran al-Majid's ayat we could not fully understand, otherwise we would say to Allah, Ya Allah, these are all theoretical things. Who would do this? And he's saying that, look, that's why Sayyid Khamenei wrote his book called the 250-year-old man. Why did he call it the 250-year-old man? You know, people say respect of scholars or not. I think the biggest form of respecting a scholar is to read their works. It's very strange that people say, I respect the scholar, I respect Sayyid this and Sayyid that and Sheikh this and Sheikh that. Have you read anything they've said? Have you read any works from them? Do you know anything that they've said? In fact, believe me, and these are not my words, these are scholars who have said this, if Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen were even to come here, we would not know what he's written in his life. We would know maybe a thing or two from Nahjul Balagha here, but the way Imam Ali would implement his leadership, perhaps we would say, Imam Ali, I don't like your form of leadership. Imam Hassan, I don't like your form of leadership. Imam Hussein, I don't like your form of leadership. I thought you were going to let me have my form of community, my form of Islam. And the reality of the matter is, sometimes we have pseudo-respect. You know what pseudo-respect is? Pseudo-respect is, you say Salamu alaikum, MashaAllah, things like this. What's one of the biggest examples of pseudo-respect in our communities? One of the biggest examples of pseudo-respect is Maulana. MashaAllah, Maulana, MashaAllah, let me kiss the hand, Alhamdulillah. But as soon as you turn around, son, never be like that. That's not your job. You're never going to be a Maulana. It's like the worst, it's a death sentence. And the reality of the matter is that double-sidedness or that two-facedness, and we all do it, is something that is very clear to read between and very clear to understand. The same reason I'm very adamant about us being very clear about making sure that our centers, masajids, imam bargahs are run in the right way is exactly because of the credibility of the institution. If you play games with the religion of God, not today, not tomorrow, but down the road, people will see it as clear as day. And when they realize it, and which is already happening by the way, I'm having to deal with the young people who, if I'm being very honest with you, I don't blame some of them. They're saying, Sayyid, you want me to go to this place or this community? I'm not taking any names of places where I know this, and this is not being done according to Islam. So what Islam are we talking about here? Let's be real. Let's be authentic. Let's be substantive. And times have changed. And it's important for us to understand that. And if we want people to be in these masajids, Imam Bargas, Husainiyas, we have to prioritize the implementation of their leadership to be based on Islamic principles. And we learned that from the Ahlul Bayt. Even in difficult times, the Imams didn't compromise on Islamic principles. Yes, they may have been doing things behind the scenes, and even still, they had to hear things. Imam Hassan, his own Shi'as called Imam Hassan, after he signed the peace treaty with Muawiyah. Now, look, the Imam was willing to fight, and he had fought, and he had put people at Maskan and Madain. At the same time, what happened was, eventually, he signed the peace treaty because the people weren't supporting him. And when the people weren't supporting him, what happened was, they used to say afterwards, the Shia, not the enemy, the Shia used to say, Assalamu alayka ya mudhill al-mu'minin. Oh, the one who disgraced the mu'minin. And so what I'm saying is, sometimes people don't understand. And you may find the person who's the bad guy today, in the long run, sometimes may actually be the good guy in the long run. Example, during the time of Banu Umayyah for 90 years, Imam Ali alayhi salam was cursed from the minbar. He was cursed from the minbar. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Umar II, who was the one who stopped the cursing, his own father, he had a conversation with his own father, and he said, my father, who was a very good orator and speaker, and he said, my father, I've noticed one thing, when you give your khutbah, and you give your sermon, and at the end there's one moment where you're very eloquent, but at one moment your voice starts to shudder. And that's the very famous moment where he said, you notice this? He said, yeah. He said, I know that this is not right, the cursing of Ali ibn Abi Talib, but it was a policy, right? It was a policy of the state. Similarly, eventually people understood that had it not been for Ali, there would be no Islam perhaps afterwards. So sometimes it's important for us to realize, so the Imam teaches us how to navigate this. There's another moment, and as I'm concluding here, where the Imam, the people who were of the scholarship understood the value. For example, Ibn Sakit. Ibn Sakit, the one who was the tutor for the Abbasid Khulafa's children, this is the same one who came forward and they asked him, are my children Afdal or Hassan and Hussein, the children of Ali ibn Abi Talib? And he couldn't take it. And eventually he said, you're comparing your kids to Hassan and Hussein. He said, your kids don't even compare to Qambar, the servant of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Of course they cut out his tongue, but that was the truth. This is also the Imam al-Hadi, who gave us a very wise wisdom of the time that even we can implement today. You want to solve some of the problems when you have difficulty? The Imam gave us an example. What do you do? The Imam gave some money to one of his Shias, and he said, I want you to go and do dua for me. Where? Go to do dua for me in Karbala. Now, during this time, as you know, the Abbasids are trying to destroy Karbala. Mutawakkil, and these are some of the worst ashqal ashqiya. They tried to destroy Karbala sometimes 50 times or more. And in this environment, Imam is saying, so now the Shia is saying, Yabna Rasulullah, one second. We come to you for dua. You're telling me to go and do dua on your behalf, and that too go to Karbala to do dua. Why? Now the Imam knew he's going to ask this, so he said, look, there's a principle here. Allah has made certain places. He said, if you're asking me this, I want you to consider another question before it. And that is, whenever Rasulullah needed to make a major dua, why is it that he used to do tawaf of the Kaaba, then he would go to do the ziyarah of Hajr al-Aswad, he would kiss Hajr al-Aswad, and then he would raise his hands and do dua towards Allah. So those who say, for example, Islam doesn't have this concept of sha'air, they may not fully understand the history of Islam, because even Rasulullah at times was doing these elements of the equation. I'm not saying that we should have a blanket policy, but what our scholars say is what we should adhere to. At the same time, our manzil should never be forgotten. Our goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will never find that the Imams called anyone to themselves for their own sake as an end. They were always saying the destination and the goal and the hadaf is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're just here to help guide you on that way. And so at that point in time, the rulers of the time. Another moment they say to this, the Imam is telling him, there's a particular place. So now if you find yourself in difficulty, Karbala is a wonderful place to go, do dua, and you and I don't have to pay the tax that some others used to have to pay in the past. That people used to have to pay an arm, for example, or a limb in order to go for the ziyarah. This was that time, during that Imam's time. But further than this, when you come to this, you'll find that this Imam even helped one of his Shias in the most difficult positions. Yunus Un-Naqash. Yunus Un-Naqash was a jeweler or an artisan who used to work with jewelry, and he was called by the ruler of the time from Banu Abbas, and he was told that I want you to inscribe this on this ring, on this stone, this gemstone that needs to be placed in a ring. And when he is told this, he goes back and he takes this back to his workshop, and his workshop was in his house. And at that moment in time, he's working through the night, and he's working continuously, Yunus Un-Naqash, on this. And when he's working continuously on this artwork that he's been commissioned to do by the ruling party, eventually he stepped away for a little bit, maybe to get some tea or coffee or water or whatever it was to do. But when he came back, he had noticed that his children had been playing in the environment. They had been playing in the room, and eventually they had broken the jewel, the gem, this very, very expensive gem. They had broken it into two. Now imagine what had been going through this man's heart. So he was a Shia, and he called upon Imam Hadi, and he had gone to Imam Hadi. He said, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, I'm in a very difficult predicament. He said, what is it? He said, I've been given one of the most expensive jewels by the ruler, and I've been asked to do artwork on it. I did the artwork, and I was in the process of it, and when I was in the process of it, my children, they broke it. What do I do? He said, no, not to worry. He said, look, I want you to do the following. Tomorrow, you'll be summoned to go to the house of the palace of the Amir. I want you to go, but when you go, make sure you do istighatha and you take our name before you go. Now, the principle here being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already said from the get-go that there are certain examples of tawassul. In fact, you will find that even the second Khalifa did tawassul for rain to descend in the city, in the Medina, during his era and time. And you'll find many examples that tawassul was a commonality amongst all Muslims up until the time of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I wish I had the time, I would go into that. But now, coming here, when it came to this, he said he went. When he got in front of the Abbasid ruler, he was shaking in a state of fear that what's going to happen. And he asked him, did you do what I asked you to do? Did you make the jewelry? Did you do the artwork? And before he's about to answer, and he's in a state where maybe, he's in fear to say something. But before he could answer, he said, I hope you didn't. I hope you didn't. He said, don't do it. So what? He said, what do you mean? He said, look, last night I told my intention to my wives. So he had more than one wife. And so he said they began to dispute, and both of them wanted the jewel. And they wanted the jewelry to be made from this. The big rulers are even afraid of their wives. And in that environment, he says, I need you to split this in two. And it's like a 20-ton boulder was removed from the chest of Yunus Un-Naqash. He said, you know what, if you need that, maybe I can make it happen for you. At that moment, he turned away and his problem was solved, but he came back to Imam al-Hadi. He said, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, I just have one question. Are du'as answered in this way as well? As in, he couldn't have fathomed. He could not even contemplate. He said, when you do du'a to Allah by our tawassul with yaqeen, they're answered in this way as well. So I invite you and I invite myself to make that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His representatives. Because His representatives remind us that it's possible. Otherwise, we may start thinking it's not possible. It's not viable. Allah, if He wanted, He could make our du'as accepted directly, and He does at times. But He made the places such as the Kaaba, He made the places such as Karbala, He made the places where there are higher spiritual proximities. Nonetheless, there's many things to learn, and inshallah, I invite you and myself to learn from the life of Imam al-Hadi. But eventually, the oppressors could not take it anymore. And eventually they got to the point where they said, we must eliminate this individual. They were trying to make sure the 12th Imam is not born, so they began to poison the later Imams. The narrations say that they gave poison to Imam al-Hadi, and the poison began to mix in the blood of the Imam. The narrations say that he began to feel the pangs of his final moments, and the blood began to overtake the Imam. Imam al-Askari was there, and as you know, there was an environment where they had even separated the families. Eventually, the narrations say that Imam al-Askari, he made the arrangements because he buried him. He gave the ghusl, he gave the kafan, and he made all of the arrangements for his father to be buried eventually. But of course, the rulers, they wanted to show that they were on his side, so they had everything done once again in public. Regardless, Imam Askari and the Ahlul Bayt, they knew that the ghusl, the kafan, and all the arrangements had been done, although this Imam had to suffer. But ajrukum ala Allah, azadaro, wo marhala kaisa hoga, jab Sayyidus Sajidin 3 din ke baad ba-ijaz imamat Karbala pahunche, to kya dekhte hain, baba ka lasha hai, sar tan se juda hai, kahin angushtari hai, kahin haath hai, aur kahin Abbas ka lasha ہے اور کہیں علی اکبر کا لاشا ہے. کس کس کو دیکھے امام, اور غسل اور کفن تو کیا امام عالی مقام امام حسین کا جو غسل تھا وہ خود ان کا خون تھا, اور ان کا جو کفن تھا وہ خاک کربلا تھی. على لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله, صلى الله عليك يا أمير المؤمنين, صلى الله عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين, صلى الله عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. معتم حسين يا حسين يا حسين.
عزیزوں کیا غضب آیا نقی جب سے عزیزوں کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس شہنشاہ دو عالم وہ اٹھا جگ سے ہزار افسوس. نبی مرکد میں روتے ہیں علی جنت سے آئے ہیں. نبی مرکد میں روتے ہیں علی جنت سے آئے ہیں. کھولے سرفوں تیما پوتے کورونی یہاں پہ آئی ہیں. عزیزوں کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس شہنشاہ دو عالم وہ اٹھا جگ سے ہزار افسوس. کرو ماتم سبھی مل کے قیامت ہوئے عزاداروں. کرو ماتم سبھی مل کے قیامت ہوئے آزادارو دیا ظالموں نے ہے یہ زہر شہ کو اے آزادارو عزیزوں کیا Un-Naqi جگ سے اونچا افسوس شہنشاہی دو عالم وہ اٹھا جگ سے زور افسوس یوں رو روس کری ناشے پیدر پہ کہتے ہیں ہر بار یوں رو روس کری ناشے پیدر پہ کہتے ہیں ہر بار ہوا بن باپو کا افسوس کروں کیا میں جگر افغار میرا بابا یہ کیسی نیند میں سوئے میرا بابا یہ کیسی نیند میں سوئے میں روتا ہوں کھڑا یہاں پہ تسلی اٹھ کے دے دیجئے عزیزوں کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس شہنشاہ دو عالم وہ اٹھا جگ سے ہزار افسوس یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسین مارے گئے پیری میں حبیب ابن مظاہر مارے گئے پیری میں حبیب ابن مظاہر اور قتل ہوا حر وفادار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی ارکار حسین عاشور کے دن لشکر اعدا کی جفا سے عاشور کے دن لشکر اعدا کی جفا سے بے جان ہوا آپ کا انصار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسین ٹھنڈا ہوا ہے عالم لشکر اللہ ٹھنڈا ہوا ہے عالم لشکر اللہ دریا پہ موا تیرا علمدار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسین کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسین افسوس ملی خاک پہ اکبر کی جوانی افسوس ملی خاک پہ اکبر کی جوانی آئی ہے شبیہ احمد مختار حسین یا شاہ زمن سید ابرار حسينا يا شهيد زمن سيد أبرار حسينا کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسینم تا وعدہ جو سر دینے کا سو دے دیا سر کو تا وعدہ جو سر دینے کا سو دے دیا سر کو قربان تر و صادق الأكرار حسينا يا شاهي زمن سيد أبرار حسينا يا شاهي زمن سيد أبرار حسينا کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسینا یا شاہی زمن سید ابرار حسینا شاہی زمن سید ابرار حسینا کربل میں تیری لٹ گئی سرکار حسینا. سورة الفاتحة.
زيارة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء، السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين وللأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بكيت وبكى الليل والنهار ولا أجله الله لحت مني زيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى تسعة المعصومين من ذريتك علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر ولي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد الحسن بن علي والهجرة بن الحسن أجل الله فرجا وسهل الله محجا ودهورا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كل وليك الهجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقاودا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعوا فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.